Heidi, I think I always feel that healing never good enough is very much at the core of what you do, and I also feel like it's a favourite subject of yours. Would you say this is at the core of all your teaching?
Well, I think when you kind of boil something down to, well, what is it? What is this thing in life? Why can't I do this? Why can't I have that? Why is it that things kind of go in the right direction and then all of a sudden I feel like something sabotages or something pops up in the way or all of that kind of stuff? People ask me that all the time. And I think if you keep asking someone, why do you think, why do you think, why do you think, why do you think? Eventually they're going to say something along the lines of, well, maybe it's because I don't actually feel good enough. And they maybe say that early on, or they'll say it later on down the line of that conversation. So when it comes to anything, I think anything along the lines of how we see something in life around transformation, whether we feel it's a personal transformation or changing something or changing a dynamic within ourselves or in our outer life, it comes down to essentially feeling that you're enough, feeling that you're good enough to allow that in your life. So yes, you could say that it is, healing, feeling never good enough is one of my favorite subject areas, because whenever it comes to a limitation, I think if you look at it from that perspective, then it becomes 10 times easier to solve it or change it. Because when it comes to not feeling good enough, I think it's always something that you can change.
Do you think it's exacerbated? Is it a sign of our times? Because doesn't everybody have to deal with the feeling of not good enough to a certain extent? Why is this particularly so for sensitives?
Well, if you look at it from the line of, how someone comes into this world with a higher level of sensitivity. So, it's not something that you just acquire during your life. It's something you come in with. So your very foundation, so your whole life experience is based around feeling more sensitized to your environment. So more sensitive to other people, more sensitive to other people's moods, more sensitive to feeling that you need to make sure that everybody else is feeling fine, because otherwise it causes you stress. I think if you've always had that as part of your own environment, your own internal environment, then because you don't feel relaxed about things, because you do react to stress or all that kind of stuff, then you're going to spend your life wondering, am I good enough? Is it me? Is it me being over this or over that? Oversensitive. Well, the fact is, if you've come in, you're born with that highly developed kind of connection to the nervous system, you're going to immediately assume that anything that feels slightly different to what everybody else seems to be focused on or dealing with, and that you're not immediately comfortable with that, you're going to think, well, hang on a second, maybe I'm not good enough.
So it's magnified for us as a sensitive?
Well, I think it is a magnified part of the sensitive, but I also think that that's kind of sort of suggesting that it's feeling never good enough is some kind of disability. And I would say, yes, it is a disability to start with. But then when you start addressing it and looking at it along the lines of its flip side of feeling good enough, you then start to have a perspective on things. You start to have a perspective in terms of your own internal feelings around empathy and empathizing towards yourself, but also towards other people, because you can then see from their perspective. If someone has always felt, oh, well, yes, I'm wonderful, I'm great, I'm good enough and everything, then do they really have an understanding and a perspective for somebody else? I would say no. I would say someone would call them egotistical or arrogant or removed from understanding of somebody else. So I think, if you've come from a position of not feeling enough, I think it's a big plus, because when you start transcending that and you start to feel the other side of that in terms of good enough, you can see things from two perspectives, and you can also then have a compassion for yourself, for your own situation, and for other people's, because you then understand what it feels like when you don't feel it's enough or you're good enough, and what it means to give someone confidence.
So let's talk about the flip side, feeling good enough. What is it to feel good enough? What does that actually feel like? So for people, they're sort of looking at exploring healing this area, what can they expect?
When they, in terms of feeling good enough?
In terms of the journey, in terms of what will transpire, in terms of what it's like to come out on the other side.
What it feels like to come out the other side and feel good enough. Well, I think, the essential part is that you start to feel calmer, and you start to feel a warmth of compassion, because all sensitives are used to feeling, empathic and compassion towards everybody else, and identifying with other people's feelings and internal world. But imagine if you're able to do that for yourself, what difference that would make to your own internal world, how supported you would then feel. It wouldn't then mean that you have to rely on other people in terms of your sense of identity. You'd already have it. You'd already have this feeling that, whatever you came across where you had previously or assumed that you're not good enough, to then feel that you have an option on it, that you have an option to then feel good enough, because you have enough self-compassion in order to feel enough. And you can't have a self-compassion if you don't feel good enough. If you don't feel good enough, full stop, you won't allow yourself a sense of compassion for your own decisions, your own movement, your own challenges, your own fears. Fears are normal. Fears, being fearful of things or uncertain of something new, is normal. It's not, but most sensitives see it as some kind of failing or disability. The fact is that even though you fear something, it doesn't mean that it has to stop you. And healing that component, or your relationship with never feeling good enough. If you think about where never feeling good enough comes from, okay, it must come from, at some level, from your external world. So either you've never lived up to any expectations. And why haven't you lived up to those expectations? Well, most likely because those expectations were unreasonable or continually changing. So therefore, actually, that other person's behavior towards you, it was abusive. There's no other, there's no polite way of putting it. It's abusive. Mm-hmm. Because everyone is born perfect, exactly the way that they are. Mm-hmm. And it's about then, growing into your own skin of self-acceptance, which is very tough when you're still listening to some kind of externalized voice in saying that you were never enough. So as an example, if I use my own example, I was told, from point of which I can remember, that whatever I did wasn't enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't, good girl enough, even though I did my utmost to be a good girl enough, but I wasn't learning enough. I wasn't behaving well enough. I had my own mind, which wasn't good enough. There was always something, but the goals were always changing. It was forever changing. until I would say probably I got to my teenage years and was completely confused. And then got to that point of feeling, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to conform to what fits? Because by that time, quite often, as it was in my example, what I was conforming to within my environment was different to what the experience of the external world was. The external world wasn't as hard on me as my internal environment had become, as in how, you know, my immediate environment had told me whether I was good enough or not good enough. And so by the time I got to my adult years, there had to be some kind of decision made. Was I to be defined by those who I grew up with? Because those who I grew up with said always that I wasn't enough. Or was it time to make some kind of transition into my own identity and my own kind of relationship with the external world? And so quite often, I would say, people find that there comes a point where they have to choose.
So what, for you in particular, what were some of the areas that showed up as resistance to healing never good enough? And then how did you deal with those? And then also, what was the crux? What was that moment where you thought, or was it an inspiration that you just thought, this has to be done, it's now or never? Lead us through that journey.
Well, I would say there's a choice between existence and living. Mm-hmm. And I think it probably came to a point where I would say in my early adult life, I would say probably in my 20s, where I would significantly say that I made a decision. And actual fact, I can probably tell you the exact time I made a decision. I was in my early 20s, and I'd moved out of my parents' home, where I felt absolutely I was never good enough. I even went back to visit and was told categorically that I wasn't good enough because I'd chosen to leave. You know, by that time I was in my nearly my mid-20s, but surely that's okay to leave home. And by that time I was almost into my mid-20s, I think. Yeah, I was. And I was told very clearly that I wasn't welcome because I'd left home. And so I wasn't good enough to stay, you know, I wasn't good enough to visit. So I thought, oh, okay, charming. And then I found myself in another environment. So I kind of went from the frying pan into the fire because it became familiar. It was familiar. What was familiar to me was strong-willed people who were offensive. So I moved into another environment, and I had this landlady from hell, quite frankly, who again told me that I was, whatever I did wasn't good enough. So if I left, and this is how ridiculous it sounds and how kind of exaggerated it became. If I'd left a laundry basket in a place that she didn't like, even for 5 minutes, it wasn't good enough. If I had messages on my answer phone machine that I hadn't played back and erased within 5 seconds of walking in the door, that was terrible, and I wasn't good enough. I wasn't organised enough. If I was tapping on a keyboard, you know, I was paying rent. I'm sure I was allowed to tap on a keyboard, but apparently not. So I wasn't allowed to tap on a keyboard, that I had to tap somewhere else or whatever. And it was, whatever I was doing, I wasn't quiet enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't putting things away enough. I wasn't something enough. Or if I had someone round, they didn't leave exactly on the time that she wanted them to leave. You know, all of this kind of stuff. It became wildly exaggerated. And I can remember the day feeling, this is enough. You know, I'm never good enough. And I can remember sitting in my room, and by that time I'd bought a laptop, I think. It's early times in laptops, and laptops then were extremely expensive. And it had a very quiet keyboard. And I remember thinking to myself, do you know what? I am damn well good enough. Stuff all of you. And I think I actually and I do remember I made the decision then. It was a decision I made, which was, I'm not believing this anymore. And I'm not going to be a victim of this anymore. And it was at that time I made the decision. Of course, it takes sometimes a while for these things to adjust and change. I made the decision that actually I was good enough. And now I was going to start being good enough. And it was at that point that it wasn't for a while until I was able to move out of that environment. But it was at that point that I made the decision that I was going to change things. That I was good enough, and I would surround myself in a scenario where I was enough.
And the impact of that decision, did you start to see it immediately, or did it kind of come around slowly in bits and changes started to occur? Because it can happen quite quickly.
Well, yes, I think it can now. I mean, then I think it was a lot slower because there was no frame of reference. There was no one to help. There was no one to ask. There was no one to involve myself with. There was nothing to look at that was any other indication of myself other than the people that were presented around me. Because of course, when you've got all of those in your immediate environment who say you're not enough, well, of course you're going to start believing it.
So was it a case of going back to the drawing board and actually just scrapping your old identity and then rebuilding and creating a new one? Is that what you mean when you say it's about changing your identity? And is that why it's so difficult for people to go there?
Well, I stopped then. I'd say that day I stopped identifying myself as a victim. Mm-hmm. I would say I absolutely decided then that actually identifying myself as that would mean that I would just keep going from frying pans into fires. I would keep finding myself around characters who were either, overly controlling or were sort of had this strange view of the world. I would keep finding myself in that scenario. And so I decided that to not identify myself as a victim anymore. And I would say absolutely, categorically, up to that day, I probably did. So I changed my identity in terms of becoming myself. I decided that I wasn't going to be a victim anymore, and I wasn't going to run by the rules of everybody else, because I'd had enough, because I still wasn't enough, even though I was conforming to their rules. And whoever that was, whether it was the mad landlady or it was the environment that I found myself in from the year dot. No one encouraged me. What I'm saying is that I waited for someone to come and encourage me, and nobody came. Nobody came. No one, no one came. No one. Absolutely nobody. So it was a decision that had to be made. And yes, what I do now is a lot to do with the fact that I understand what it's like, and obviously this makes me emotional, what it's like to feel that no one's coming for you. And so I don't feel emotional for myself. I feel emotional for the people that I do my best to assist in life, is because when they express that to me, that they feel that no one has come for them, that I think, well, what do you think I try and do? Because it is, and as you say, this is my core passion around solving feeling never good enough, because I know the difference it can make the moment that you decide. But also I understand not everybody feels able to dump their victim self and go, do you know what, stuff that. I get that. And I also get that some people need to be encouraged. And I think that's all I do, is do my best to encourage people to accept that actually they are enough. And it's not about, healing never good enough doesn't mean that you have to become somebody else. That's not what I mean by changing your identity. What I mean, means becoming yourself. And I decided that day when I was tapping away on that laptop, buried away in my bedroom, trying to be as quiet as possible because tapping on a keyboard offended this woman. That actually I thought, no, I've had enough of this. If I carry on like this, I'll just move on to the next one.
So for those who feel that, how did I've done so much work, and I've worked through this healing never good enough, and I've really tried to heal this feeling of never good enough, but I still don't feel that it's adjusted. What's that about? Is that not having really made the decision at your core? Is that what it is?
Well, I think it's about, if you feel that it hasn't, it's not working, it's not changing, it's not doing something, I think it is about making a decision. But at the same time, it doesn't magically disappear. Okay. I would say that I remember that as being the time that I decided. It didn't mean to say that then immediately everything changed, but it means that the decision was made. So I think you have to have a look at, what are your expectations of feeling good enough? Mine was simply a peaceful life where I was treated with some respect because I gave other people, I was kind to other people. I didn't see why I didn't deserve that in return. Apparently I didn't deserve that in return because I wasn't good enough. But I think it also came to the point of realizing that whatever, I wouldn't have been enough. So I came to the realization it wasn't actually me. It wasn't me. Yeah. And I think, you have to come to a decision where you have to decide and think, well, actually, maybe if I've been trying all these years to be good enough for this person or this thing or that thing, maybe it's not me. Maybe it's the expectation. And maybe I need to adjust my relationship with the expectation.
Do you think people are scared that they will be lost in there and that they'll lose people and that they'll lose friends, or things will change quite drastically? Is that hindering the decision, do you think?
Well, I think that is a real fear, because I think when you have been easily, manipulated, or you've danced a tune to somebody else and then all of a sudden you go, no, I'm not dancing that anymore. Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. People who then expect you to dance to that tune are in for a rude awakening. But anyone who's respectful and who's a nice person to be interacting with will say, yippee, wahee, finally, you actually decided that you've got your own decisions to make, that you want to do something off your own back, not because it's time to be approved of, or this or that, or what have you, that you're actually making a decision for yourself. And I think true friends celebrate the fact that you make decisions for yourself.
I loved what you just said about creating your own tune. That's what you're saying. Create your own tune. So this is all around creating your own rules, but it can be playful when you put it to music, I suppose, like that metaphor. I loved it. So creating this new, or coming into yourself, can be a playful and artistic process. It doesn't have to be a fearful journey, which some are feeling that it might be.
That it doesn't have to be a
Fearful journey.
A fear-based journey. No, it doesn't have to be a fear-based journey at all. Not at all. And you don't have to, announce to the world, right, I'm going to suddenly feel good enough, and stuff the lot of you. It's an internal flowering. That's how I would say. It's an internal flowering, which then means that even when someone is, yapping at you that you're not good enough, that flower is, well, actually I am. So it's not me, it must be you. And therefore I don't have to take that view as my actual identity. And I think when you've got that, you're then not bouncing around for approval.
So what could be happening is that people are waiting for permission to change their identity, which is never going to come.
Absolutely, it never comes. And I can say, from my own experience, it was never going to come. And I could have spent a lot of my life, waiting and waiting and waiting, but really actually eroding something inside. Or I could have just made the choice. And yes, it probably took the mad landlady for me to actually go, whoa, hang on a second.
The last resort.
There is lines of where somehow this has got to stop. And the only way that it would stop, as far as I eventually looked at it, was if I changed something. And as a victim, I was an easy target. Because people who've got, and in all honesty, there are some not very nice people out there. And, 9 times out of 10, those not very nice people aren't very self-responsible or honest with themselves. And I think if you're at least honest with the fact that you've got this thing that says you don't feel good enough, if you're honest, you're 3/4 of the way there. Whereas there's a whole bunch of people who've got that and they don't feel good enough, but they don't own it. So they shred other people for it, and make them try and make them feel as insignificant as possible, because it helps them to not feel their own rejected emotion. But I tell you, it's the brave who actually own the fact that they don't feel good enough. And because they're the ones who have the option to change it.
So you talked on the webinar about variations of the never good enough feeling. So there's the adult child, and then there's, for example, there's the ego child, etc. Do the different variations relate to, is there any correlation between those categories or those groupings and your ACE score?
And does it relate to your ACE score? As to which one you are? So whether you're the hero child or the lost child?
Could there be a correlation?
I think if you have a score of 0, an ACE score of 0, so a child diversity score of 0, and you can still identify yourself as one of those characters, whether you're a hero child, a lost child, or the placator, or whatever, a mascot, then I think you're being dishonest about your ACE score, to be honest. So if you've got a 0 and a 0 score, then but you can still identify with one of those characters, then, as I say, something is amiss in that dynamic. But let's say that is the case. You have an A score, and 0 A score, but you can still identify as one of those particular characters. Then you wouldn't have to look very far. You'd only have to look at your parents, and most likely that they have come from a scenario where they've had some kind of significant childhood adversity, which has given them a perspective where they find it difficult to. They've done their best. They've really done. They've done their utmost. They've done their best. But their adversity has affected their parenting skills, as it does. My own adversity, when I have an ACE score of 7, and I would very honestly say that as far as my own children are concerned, I'm not a perfect parent. I'm not a perfect example, but at least I'm honest. I'm honest with my failings. I'm honest with my shortfalls. I'm honest with my children that I'm not this perfect person. I don't do things perfectly, and I don't have all the answers. So they get to identify the fact that I'm human too. But I think when people don't own the fact that they don't feel good enough, or they're not this or they're not that, if they don't own it, then it becomes this kind of secret. All becomes sort of immersed around this secret, this thing, this elephant that you never talk of. And then, that elephant that you never talk of gets passed through the generations as becoming the big elephant that you never speak of. And then the elephant gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So, as far as my own children are concerned, I go, there's a flipping great big elephant in the room. Let's find out why it's here. So then, if they don't feel good enough around something in their own life, they can at least then begin to be honest.
There's, we're moving into this place where there's a lot of people talking about loving yourself and self-love. And I'm not quite sure if a lot of people really understand what that means or how to go about that, as in what are the steps. But I feel that healing never good enough is the how to self-love.
Yes, because I think, self-love is, if we're then trying to do something along the lines of, say, I love myself, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to make decisions to love myself and all this kind of stuff. Then what's going to happen in terms of your internal world and your headspace is going to go, no, you're not. That's absolute codswallop. That's not true. Mm-hmm. Or it's going to say, I love myself. And this other part's going to say, no, you don't. I'm going to prove it to you. There you go.
That's where the saboteur kicks in.
Exactly. You're not worth it. So, and then all you can do is then fail. Because you're going for this self-love thing, and all you can do is then fail. So if you're then addressing that you don't feel good enough and actually saying, well, okay, we don't feel good enough, and then that voice goes, no, it hasn't got an answer for it. But if you're honest and you say, I don't currently feel good enough, but I'm seeking to solve that, and I'm going to sort it out, because I don't want to play that identity anymore. I don't want to be that victim identity anymore. We're sorting it out. What are you going to do about it? The inner voice is going to go, blah, 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 blah. instead of you going, blah, 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 blah. Whereas if you're trying to force down your own throat, oh yeah, self-love, 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 you're not, it gives it food. It gives it food for trying to tear you apart. And that shows in, the external world and other people's behavior. People mock people who say, oh, self-love, self-love, and say that. And, if someone in your life doesn't believe in that, it gives them an excuse to mock you as well as the internal world does. And then all it's going to do is then implode you and say, well, I don't feel good enough. So, in my view, it's all about owning it and go, yeah, I don't, Sand. So I'm doing something about it. It's if you feel that dynamic, if you feel that yourself, so I mean, if I say that to you, if you said to me, well, yeah, you're self-love, not good enough. And then if I say to you, well, yeah, I'm not good enough. What's the problem with it? What's your answer? You haven't got one.
Exactly.
It shuts it off.
Yeah, it stops feeding it.
Yeah, exactly. And then someone who behaves in that particular way hasn't got any food to tear you apart over it. And it leaves you alone enough to then be able to get on with changing it, adjusting it, amending it, and solving it. To have the space enough. So healing never good enough is really about giving yourself the space to heal.
Sounds like self-respect as well.
Well, it's about giving yourself a boundary. It's hard if you've never had the opportunities of boundaries in your life. It's hard to just, suddenly start placing them, because it then feels like you're putting up fences.
Towards the end of the webinar, I really had to laugh out loud when you were at the point where you just said, just stop it. It was so sweet. Do you remember the part I'm talking about? It was really funny. All this, about not good enough and offensive and all of that. And you just said, just stop it. And it was just so sweet and so funny. But because that's how it is. That's where we are now. It is to the point where we do need to step up and solve this so that everything else can assimilate and fall into place and become.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say, that time when I was tapping away, trying to be as quiet as possible in that room, going, oh, no, mustn't make her.
I'm trying not to exist, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I just suddenly went, for crying out loud, stop it. Stop it. Because whatever I do isn't going to be right for this person. Yeah. Stop it.
Yeah. Heidi, thank you so much. Always such a pleasure to talk to you. And we've covered so much there, so I'm really hoping that everyone will have something to take away with them.
Excellent. Thank you, Sawyer.
Thank you. Bye.